Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads, episode 127, Friday, November 11th. We are getting into fall. Upcoming events, FDA news, and then MedHealth Summit interviews continue. We had such a good time filming those on site at the MedHealth Summit on November 1st. Dr. Philip Levy's interview today. I love talking to Dr. Levy. He's been on the show, I think, twice before during COVID. Now he's got quite a role at Wayne State University, all about population health, and he's really thinking about how to take care of underserved demographics, sort of on a city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood basis. Some amazing stuff in his Phoenix project that they're doing. So we'll have that whole interview for you here in just a moment. But first, news today that we're going to be talking about in just a second. MichBio says that Michigan life sciences growth is actually above average for the nation. Some really good news. Michigan hospitals being penalized for readmissions. We'll talk about that. MAUDE and openFDA get some small updates, but what are those in the first place? We'll talk about that. FDA is reminding innovators about some of the cool resources that they have that you can have access to, and we'll tell you about those. And then finally, FDA has clarified what a counterfeit device is. Some of it is obvious, some of it is not. But first, the upcoming events in the local and national ecosystem. The Combination Product Summit just happened down in Columbus, Ohio. I hope some of you were able to go to that. Robin Rowe reached out to me and said, the 2023 AI Summit is next November 14th and 16th. So you can put that on your calendars already. It's coming back around, and it sounds from all things that it was a good event. November 14th and 15th, the U of M Data Science and AI Summit hosted by MIDAS at U of M. Scan the QR code if you're interested in data science and artificial intelligence. Sounds like the place to be, coming up November 14th and 15th. And then the 14th through the 17th, I'm going to be at this one. In Germany, Medica is happening, and the Michigan Economic Development Corporation is taking a trade delegation. They're going to set 6 companies up at kiosks there on the trade show floor, talking all about Michigan and all the cool companies here doing medical technology. Then on November 15th, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is hosting a virtual public workshop. CDRH Industry Basics, Understanding Risk with Medical Devices. Like we told you in previous weeks, go to this one. If you're an investor, if you're a startup founder, if you work in medical devices and health tech, you should really go to this one so you understand risk from FDA's perspective. It's heart and soul of device development and the clearance process. Tuesday, November 15th. And on November 17th, Medical Extended Reality, Applications and Challenges. If you're into VR and virtual reality, augmented reality, this is the place to be to understand FDA's thinking about how that technical world merges with the regulatory world. And on November 23rd, come on out, we fixed the slide, Tech Homecoming, Ann Arbor Spark. They had a great idea. If people are coming back for Thanksgiving to the Ann Arbor area, why not get them together and have a job fair? And sounds like a very timely idea if you've heard about all of the layoffs happening in tech these days. This could be a really, really great event to be at. Scan the QR code to go and be part of Tech Homecoming on November 23rd. December 6th, the FDA broad agency announcement today. If you're interested in partnering with FDA on some of their larger things that they're trying to accomplish, they're going to announce their goals on December 6th. And then December 5th through 7th, the Digital Transformation Symposium by the Food and Drug Administration. This is FDA's IT vision and strategic direction. FDA leaders are going to talk about how the agency is leveraging advances in data, cloud, user experiences, and cybersecurity, IT governance, and operational organizational excellence to deliver on its mission to protect public health. That's their language. So you can engage with them and with industry and vendors during this 3-day symposium. You can be on site in Silver Spring for this one if you want to. It's interesting, they're having Robert McGinnis, who is apparently a race car driver for the number 39 Lamborghini, who is going to be their keynote speaker. And if that doesn't seem to relate, the reason they picked Robert is because he uses real-time data in a fun way in racing, and that's kind of their focus, is real-time data, health IT, and those sorts of things. So the Digital Transformation Symposium coming up the 5th through 7th of December. And on December 7th and 8th, this is a personal favorite of mine. I want academic PIs to attend this one. FDA Clinical Investigator Training Course, CTIC. This is talking about the design and conduct of clinical trials. And for every innovator that says, oh, I know how to run clinical trials, here's the problem. So many academic innovators know how to run clinical trials for research. They know how to write a paper based on it, and they're probably really, really good at it. But it's so different than what FDA requires for clearance. So please, if you're interested in running a clinical trial for device clearance, this would be the place to go to learn about it. On December 8th, back here in the state of Michigan, in Schoolcraft, Michigan, our friends from MichBio are hosting their next installment of the BioMixer. This time at the facilities of C2DX. Kevin MacLeod's been on the show any number of times. Wonderful company, C2DX, with a really innovative business model. They are hosting the BioMixer, MichBio's BioMixer. It's going to be in Schoolcraft, 5 to 7 p.m. on December 8th. And then in January, 23rd and 24th, the Social Determinants of Health Summit will be at the Marriott Marquis in San Diego. January and February, the Biomedical Innovation 101 webinar series, Fast Forward Medical Innovation, and the Department of Internal Medicine are having a series of webinars covering everything from the introduction to research commercialization, drugs and therapeutics, diagnostics, digital health, biomedical device development, and next steps from there. So university innovators, certainly a focus of this, but anyone who's interested in the tech commercialization pipeline coming out of the University of Michigan would probably be interested in attending some of these. Those are the local events. And next up, we're going to talk about FDA and industry news. News today, I talked about it earlier, we're going to cover it now. This from our friends at MichBio. You can scan the QR code to go to their press release. Michigan life sciences growth is above average for the nation. That's some really good news. And we have this from their document. This is from the President and CEO Stephen Rapundolo. Michigan's ranking of total bioindustry employment remains in the upper tier nationally, and notably, the state outpaced the nation in the establishment of new organizations in several sectors. That from MichBio President and CEO Stephen Rapundolo. Here are some of the details. Total life science establishments statewide grew 22%. We now have 2,429 such establishments in the state. Medical devices and equipment, we're now the 5th largest in the nation with 454 establishments, up from 6th place in 2018. Pharmaceuticals, we're the 9th largest in the nation with 184 establishments, up from 12th place in 2018. In agricultural feedstock and industrial bioscience, the 9th largest, up from 17th in 2018, with now 50 establishments. Total life science employment statewide has grown by 5.6% to 44,000 people, and it ranks Michigan in the top 15 nationally. Sadly, it is worth noting that in the same time period, employment in Michigan has dropped by 5%. Biosciences employment gone up by 5.6%. Overall employment down. So not good news for the state of Michigan overall, but certainly good news for biosciences employment. Medical devices and equipment, near and dear to our hearts here at Into Being, 10th in sector employment with nearly 12,000 people, which is just even with the 2018 ranking. Pharmaceuticals, the 9th nationwide in sector employment with about 10,000 people, up from 10th place in 2018, so moved up a spot. So some really good news there from our friends at MichBio. You can get to the whole report on the QR code that we showed just a few slides ago. All the data coming from Bio, of which MichBio is a part, but the nationwide organization Bio. And this from Crane's Detroit Business. Center for CMS, Center for Medicare, penalized nationwide 2,273 hospitals, or about 43% of all U.S. hospitals, for readmissions. So it turns out that this hospital readmissions reduction program, which was created in 2012, based on the Affordable Care Act, it evaluates the frequency in which Medicare patients are readmitted to the hospital within 30 days of a previous admission. Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they can lower their payments to these hospitals by as much as 3% if they're getting too many readmissions. And so across the state of Michigan, about 143 hospitals have been penalized. These penalizations are in the neighborhood of 1.5% in most of the cases. Some are much lower than that. But nevertheless, it's interesting that this is happening. Of course, the dollar amount is going to be much larger for those hospitals that take a lot of Medicare patients. And some hospital systems in the state of Michigan have seen losses to the tune of $1 billion over the last year. These penalties will come nowhere near that. Nationwide, these penalties are something to the tune of $300 million. But nevertheless, for those hospitals it does hit up Crane's Detroit to read the article there if you want to know more about which hospitals were involved in that challenge. And this from FDA. MAUDE and openFDA get updates, but what's MAUDE anyway? And who named that? Well, MAUDE is the Manufacturer and User Facility Device Experience. Scan the QR code if you'd like to get to this story at the FDA's website. But MAUDE is basically a searchable database that on the front contains the last 10 years of med device report data. It doesn't include data based on certain exemptions, variances, or alternative reporting requirements. And this has been the subject of some amount of debate because there are other databases that FDA maintains which are maybe less obvious, and there has been some pushback that not every adverse event makes it to MAUDE into one central repository. But nevertheless, it is a really central repository of an awful lot of medical device adverse event information. When things go wrong, it often ends up in MAUDE. There are downloadable data files that consist of voluntary reports back to June 93. There's actually data that goes before that. There are zip files all over the MAUDE database. You can pull these zip files. That's just a screenshot of all the zip files there, or actually a small fraction of the zip files. So if you're a data hound and you love data and you want to see what's gone wrong with medical devices over the previous decades, MAUDE is definitely the place to go. Now, before I tell you why and more about that, let's talk about openFDA, a newer but still really interesting data repository. Not only all sorts of data about recalls, they got drugs, they got devices, they got everything in here, but they also have APIs that allow you to access the data. So again, if you're interested in studying these sorts of things, MAUDE and openFDA, two amazing resources that I know we use it into being. But let's talk a little bit more about why study what went wrong before we tell you what's changed with these two databases. Why should you study what went wrong? That may seem like an obvious answer because those of us engaged in healthcare development, we want to make it better, right? Well, that's true. That's a very good reason to want to study what went wrong. But beyond that, here's the word, risk. Can I have two words? Okay, risk management. This is heart and soul of medical device and, in general, medical product development, including drugs and everything else under the sun that treats people. We need to manage risk, and there are standards out there for how you manage risk. In fact, there's often requirements to consider what has gone wrong in previous generations of devices. So understanding what has gone wrong in a device class that you may be interested in is really important. This is something we do in our company all the time. We'll go to MAUDE and to other reports to be able to look and see how have similar devices fared in the marketplace. What kinds of errors do they have? And what you find is very interesting, and it could be surprising. Okay, so what got added to MAUDE and to openFDA? Really, it's just this, unique device identifiers. These are, for lack of a better word, the barcodes that now allow you to track things like the lot number and the production date and things like that, the manufacturer's location for every medical device in the US. The requirements were rolling out over the past 10 years. They're now fully established. And UDIs have now been added to the database so that problems can be tracked down, and you'll now have specific lot, manufacturer, and other info, which we think is pretty cool. But if you want to think about the device that you're developing, I encourage you to look at device failures. MAUDE is a publicly accessible database, openFDA publicly accessible, even if you're not a data scientist and want to dig in deeply. A cursory look through, based on some keywords, for similar devices is well worth your time. All right, FDA activities to support medical device innovators. I'm going to give some kudos to the FDA on this one. This is a recent thing that they put out. And while none of the information is truly new, it's nice to see the agency putting it all in one place for innovators to look at and to remember, oh yeah, these are the ways that I can interact with the agency. Here's the first one, the FDA's Q submission program. Informational meetings and pre-submissions. Now, a lot of you know about these things. If you want to read more about them, overarchingly, the link on the left is based on the press release that FDA put out. The three links on the right are about Q submission program, informational meetings, and pre-submissions. FDA wants to remind innovators that you can talk to the agency. You don't even have to ask a question. You can just tell them about the technology that you're developing in an informational meeting. Now, sometimes this is a good idea and sometimes it's a bad idea. So do talk with those who are knowledgeable in the space to find out whether you want to charge in guns blazing and tell the agency everything about your product, or maybe whether it would be better to stage that information and approach it a little bit more systematically. Often the latter is good, but you do need to understand that the agency is there, ready, waiting to talk to you. You don't even have to have a question. They're willing to listen, even if it's just an informational meeting. Here's another one they want you to know about, the Breakthrough Devices Program. It's a voluntary program for certain medical devices. You do have to qualify for it. But if your device provides a more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions, the Breakthrough Program could be for you. We've gotten it for a number of our clients, and it's really refreshing to be able to interact as rapidly with the agency as you're able to in a Breakthrough Program. There's also the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. Now, this is not one that we've used, but it is one that is available to give access to communication, strategic communication between the FDA and medical device sponsors. So if you're a company that owns a product and is thinking about doing a clinical trial about it, the TAP program might be really interesting for you. You can click on those QR codes, or rather scan those QR codes to go to both of those programs. Next one is the Payer Communication Task Force. What I love about this is FDA put all these things in one spot and said, hey, innovators, it's November 2022. We just want you to remember all these programs we have for you. So good job, FDA. The Payer Communication Task Force to facilitate communication between device manufacturers and payers. This is really cool. It's not going to solve all the problems, but the reality is that communication early on whether a device would be paid for is increasingly important. Honestly, in a lot of cases that we see, so many times it's whether a device can be adopted and paid for. It has more to do with it than whether a given clinician likes the device. While the latter is really, really important, the former often wins the game. So if you want to find out more about how FDA can help you connect with payers, there's the QR code. Also, I can't even send you all the links for this next one. You're going to have to go back to the main page, CDRH, NIH, and Health and Human Services grant opportunities. I was actually surprised by how many I found down about 3/4 of the way down the page that you'll encounter. Go have a look there. It's really interesting. Lots of places where these agencies are willing to fund certain activities. And I encourage you, if you're engaged or want to be engaged with FDA, have a look at those grant opportunities. Incubators and accelerators, the FDA Experiential Learning Program, or ELP. This is something our company Into Being has actually participated in the past. A number of years ago, we had 13 FDA folks at our facility just to learn from us, just to learn about what our jobs look like. We brought in a bunch of folks from the community, and so they were able to hear from investors, from other developers, from folks in quality systems. What do you want to teach FDA? That's what the ELP is for. And you may be shocked to find out that they want to listen. And they might even send some folks your way to your facility to learn about what you're doing and what you're seeing in the marketplace. There's the link to the ELP program. And finally, FDA clarifies what a counterfeit device is. It's a new guidance from the agency as of November 14th. Scan the QR code to go read it. We'll tell you really what changed here. The FDA had a definition of a medical device. Not a big surprise. I think one word changed in this definition, and I think it was the word "a" to the word "any" based upon my reading. So this isn't going to come as any big shock. But a medical device is something that's either recognized in the National Formulary or Pharmacopoeia, or it's something that's intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, and that's intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals. It doesn't do it primarily through chemical action or metabolism. So that's a device, and it does not include software functions which are not considered devices, but many software functions are, so don't get lost down that rabbit hole. So this really has not changed in the FDA's update, but here's what has changed. They added the term counterfeit device. And this, we always like to bring news with a teachable lesson, and the teachable lesson here comes back to the concept of labeling. As you've heard us say many times before, labeling, which might be what you write about the device, it might be what's on the packaging, it might be what's made on websites, informational videos, and most importantly, sales agent statements. That's all part of labeling. And while labeling is not the whole picture here, we're going to go beyond labeling here, it is a part of it. The term counterfeit device means a device which, or the container, packaging, or labeling of which, without authorization, bears a trademark, trade name, or other identifying mark or imprint, or any likeness thereof, or is manufactured, get this, using a design of a device manufacturer, processor, packer, or distributor other than the person or persons who in fact made it. So what FDA is saying is you're not just a counterfeit device if you put a big company's name on it and sell it as though it were their product. It's not just the words, pick your favorite big device manufacturer. It's not just if you put those words on the device. It's not just if you pretend to be J&J or Baxter or some other big company. It goes down to the level of if your device uses the design of another device. So there's actually this real reach here. If you start making something and it looks too much like somebody else's, and it's using the design of theirs, if you rip off their design, that's enough, without authorization, to qualify as a counterfeit device. So in this way, I think the agency is trying to protect the market against rip-off devices that might come out and might just try to riff too closely off of what is happening from legitimate manufacturers. So there you go. FDA has updated the term of counterfeit device. And since so much of this does come down to things like labeling, it's important to recognize how important labeling is in the claims surrounding your device. And to this, FDA is actually adding the design of the device, and that's enough to make it qualify as a counterfeit device. So again, what you say about your device matters, and apparently today, even the design of your device, in terms of what it says, matters. Well, that's the news for today. Hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. We're going to take you back now to the MedHealth Summit on November 1st. We did a series of interviews on site. There were about 200 attendees at the summit, and we had a studio running there. And in partnership with Healthcare Now Radio, Meeting of the Minds podcast with MedTech Crossroads, we did a whole bunch of interviews. The one that you're about to hear now is the one that I did with Dr. Philip Levy of Wayne State University. Well, good afternoon. I'm Gene Paranak, the host of MedTech Crossroads. We are here at the MedHealth Summit at Ford Field, and I'm here with Dr. Philip Levy, who is the Associate Vice President for Translational Science at Wayne State University. An emergency medicine doctor, too, if I understand. Are you still practicing?
Yeah, intermittently. But as we'll talk about in the next 20, 30 minutes, a lot of my work has transitioned to population health outreach with mobile care delivery.
And with good basis and good exposure to inform that work. As you were the keynote today here at the MedHealth Summit, you were talking on democratizing data for healthcare innovation and action. We'll get a little bit into that. But before we do that, you were kind enough to be on MedTech Crossroads a couple of times during the pandemic. And at the time, it was all just like, what on earth is going on? You were there informing us, number one, about what was happening locally. There were a lot of actions taken. But then also we were all sort of learning together from you what was actually happening as best we could figure it out. Now we've got a little bit of hindsight looking back at those days. I know it's a passion of yours to not only look back at that, but to look forward.
Right.
And also to then say, what are the things that we should not forget? What are the things that we should do? And in general, what does healthcare look like, which I think is now part of the position that you're in.
Yep. So, maybe to just jump in and say, I certainly hope healthcare doesn't look like the past in the future, because I don't think anybody you would ask would say that healthcare was good before. Some people get good care. A lot of people get great care. I'm not, maligning the care we deliver. It's how is that care accessed? How is that care equitably distributed and shared? And how does that care really address the big issues? Because we still have the same problems before the pandemic, during the pandemic, after the pandemic that we've seen for decades in terms of people dying too young from preventable illness or preventable complications of things like high blood pressure and diabetes and high cholesterol.
and this really just accentuates the fact that we now need to talk about these things. We've always needed to talk about them, but this gives some momentum to the conversation.
Yeah, a lot of us kind of describe the pandemic as the great revealer, right? Because Detroit, as we discussed a couple of times on the show, and as everyone is aware, was an epicenter of COVID and poor COVID outcomes early on, and carried forth, right? That led to the development of a racial disparities task force in our state, which no other state had in the beginning. Some have copied it since. But it really is the idea that we saw a manifestation, which was poor outcomes from COVID. The initial perspective is it must be COVID that's causing these poor outcomes, but the reality is it's the many years of neglect from a healthcare system on a population perspective that leads people to be more susceptible to things like COVID and have bad outcomes. So said another way, you have a lot of people in our community, Detroit, surrounding areas, who have risk factors like high blood pressure and diabetes and high cholesterol. And I hone in on those because those plus smoking and obesity probably cover about 80% of the chronic illness that we encounter in the world today, right? But the point is that if people don't get care for those things early on, they develop what we call subclinical organ damage. They develop things in their heart, in their brains, in their kidneys that in the beginning aren't really detrimental. They're worrisome but not detrimental. And then they flip at some point to become a clinical detriment, and that's where people get sick. And so you have a lot of the community living in this sort of subclinical area with untreated risk factors, and then you throw COVID on top of it. Too much for the system to handle, and the great revealer, people die from that. And so the lesson from COVID really is, yes, we need better shared data infrastructures to understand how to identify where a pandemic might be beginning, might be starting to manifest, and how we can address it. But we also need to better understand how we use information to prevent the substrate, the population, from being so susceptible to this super
in the first place. Yeah. I love what you said there, and I don't think I've ever thought about it before in this way, that the population health, and I want you to define these terms really quick for us. The population health that we didn't understand at some level drove actual real-life personal health problems as this great revealer came through. But just backing way up, can you just define personal health and population health so that if somebody's listening and they hear this term, population health especially, they're going to go, what does it mean?
So we'll start with personal health because that's quite easy, right? That's the individual and their risk and their needs and what, how they engage with the healthcare system and what they do about things, right? Whether they need medications or it's diet modification or lifestyle modification or what have you. Population health can really be defined as just the health of a population. I know that sounds kind of stupid to the audience, and I'm not meaning it that way, but basically the key to population health is what do you define as the population? So you can consider the population as all black people living in Detroit. You can consider it as the entire state of Michigan. You can focus on hypertensives as a population. You can think of it that way. But when we think more broadly about population health, it's really the overall health of a community, an area, the people that live within it. And when you understand what affects population health, you understand it's more than personal health, right? It's not just what does that individual do, what do we do as a society that contributes to the risk, and how do we start to address it at a population level so that the person can get what they need.
So if I'm sitting there as an individual and I happen to have hypertension or something, and my local hospital knows about me, well, that's great because I can get care. But you're sort of saying there's this higher level where does the region know what its population is up against?
And what's contributing to that, right? So if you think about, I use an example during the talk, right? Somebody who lives in the vicinity of the Marathon oil plant, right? The oil refinery in Southwest Detroit. And, that person may have high blood pressure, right? How much of that high blood pressure or what proportion of that high blood pressure and its control is attributable to living in an environment where there's a lot of pollution in the air and a lot of particulate matter and other things that come from refining oil at a grand scale? Well, you could focus as a physician or as a healthcare system on how do I get that person's blood pressure under control, but at a population level, you need to question, what are we doing from a societal perspective that may or may not be contributing to this, and how do policies change to affect that? How do we take policy from a population lens and have it augment the personal care we're trying to deliver?
This almost gets into a political question, not a cited political question, but nevertheless, as we talk here about data in just a minute and how you use data to examine population level things, is there any worry that large entities may have things uncovered about them that, I'm not talking like healthcare systems, I'm talking like, oil refineries and other stuff like that, where all of a sudden they may not want that kind of information to come out. Is that something that we're going to have to deal with as we think about
reality, right?
things?
I think it's a reality. I watched the show The Good Nurse. I don't know if the movie, right? It was on, and it was talking about this one nurse who was slowly poisoning people in hospitals by injecting insulin into bags. I'm sorry if anyone's going to watch it and I ruin the movie. But the point is that similar to that circumstance, the hospitals knew something was awry, and rather than deal with it, they tried to fire the guy. And he worked in 9 different hospitals before somebody finally said, stop the insanity, this guy's killing people, right? And so you think about it this way, we're always going to encounter this, right? Everybody, organizations, whatever, they're always looking at that CYA, right? How do I protect my liability? To hell with the people I'm impacting, right? Why did tobacco companies fight so hard to, show that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer when we clearly know it does, right? Because they don't want to be held liable or accountable, which, as we saw, they ultimately were, and it led to, a hefty price to be attached. So you have this juxtaposition between we want cheap gas, but at what expense does it come for the populations we care for?
And there's a benefit there to the individual who says, well, I only care about my health, I don't really care about the population's health. You might learn something about your own health if 10 other people happen to be having the same problem in the same region.
Right, and but it comes down to, should we allow a refinery to go in a dense population area in the city? There's plenty of land. Can we put it somewhere else, right? I don't know. I mean, there's convenience, waterways, and all of that type of stuff that goes into industrial decisions. But maybe we come up with a solution that can help mitigate the impact on the community where that's located. So if you take environmental exposure and particulate matter and what have you, maybe, Marathon should be putting HEPA filters in everyone's home that lives in the vicinity of their plant, right? How can they be part of the solution? Not and maybe not subordinating the business model they have because they still have a business to run, but understanding the implications of running that business on the community in which they're located.
And it's population health, and this whole thing we're going to talk about data that gives you that kind of information to even be able to ask the questions. Yeah, we all do like to drive our cars, and it is important. Talk to us also really briefly about this whole concept of prevention versus treatment, because I know this is a big focus of yours, and maybe it comes as a shock that doctors shouldn't always be the ones doing all healthcare, which is like, as a doctor, it's like, what, really? Tell me more. Yeah. Prevention versus treatment.
So prevention versus treatment, right? So we can think of treatment as once you have an illness, you need care that may be acute and episodic. You got a sore throat, you go to urgent care, you're fine. Maybe, you injured your knee playing, football. We shouldn't be doing that at our age anyway, probably. But
I've given that up. Never played it, but I've given it up.
That's good. But you injure your knee, you need to go to the ER and get checked out. That's episodic care. You may need to follow up with an orthopedist. You may need surgery. Blah blah blah. That's kind of not prevention, right? That's treatment. You may end up having a heart attack or a stroke and need a whole bunch of care. That's treatment. Prevention, on the other hand, is trying to understand the risk at an individual level and putting in place the pieces to prevent the consequences from that risk. That risk can be biological, meaning, all right, my cholesterol is a little bit high. If it stays high, that's going to lead to me having coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis, which will lead to a heart attack, right? That's, 20 years removed, right? But it's identifying that risk in the population and not making the ability to identify that risk, not getting it caught up in the bottleneck of healthcare delivery that we currently have, right? And so maybe to clarify some of this and make it a little bit more accessible to everybody, right now all of healthcare is one bucket. You go to your doctor, and it doesn't matter what you're going for. It could be a nurse practitioner, it could be a PA, it doesn't matter. You go to a healthcare provider to get care. That care could be screening for prevention services. That care could be treatment for chronic illness. That care could be episodic for back pain, whatever have you.
And if you happen to be in an ER, we're going to triage you right there for any of the above.
And which is why people love the ER nowadays, because nobody wants to sit in their doctor's office and wait 30 minutes to be seen and then have the doctor put their back towards you, not because they're mean people, but because they're limited time is pressing and they need to fill out the record to be able to submit for reimbursement for that encounter. They care about you, but they also run a business, right? And so if you force things that don't need that level of interaction into that interaction, you create a barrier for many people to access it. Said another way, my mom, ill, has a heart attack, needs to see a cardiologist. That's one thing. That's treatment that's important. Me, I need to get my blood pressure checked and my blood work done every year. Do I need to go take half a day off from work and sit in a doctor's office, or can I do this somewhere else? Because I don't need that doctor to talk to me about my family. I like the conversation, but he's not my best friend. I don't really care about what's going on. I went to my doctor for my annual exam because I needed blood work, I needed my blood pressure checked, and I'm 51 and I needed a colonoscopy scheduled.
You could have done all these things without being in that room.
Without being in that room. And that's the model of care we're really talking about now. And that's a lesson that we've learned from the pandemic, going, back to the beginning of the conversation. Whatever it is, the idea that people can have alternative means of getting what they need, and it doesn't have to fit the model that has been healthcare for so long. We've talked forever about patient-centric care, right? But we've only paid lip service to it. The patient's at the center of a hospital system or a care system that is not patient-centric at all, right? I still have to go to my doctor's office to get something. I still have to make an appointment, wait however long to get in, right? When alternatively, there might be other pathways. I could go to a mobile program and get screened. I could go to CVS and get my blood pressure measured. You can think about different entry points to get the care delivered. And in a prevention mindset, the goal is to screen as many people as possible, not to restrict access. So why use an access restricting mechanism like a doctor's appointment versus open access to many different
which if we're in the middle of an emergency, maybe makes sense. You've got this whole team there ready to go, but what we're sort of saying is your customer experience as a consumer would actually be better if I wasn't faced up to this thing that is capable of dealing with an emergency.
Well, and here's the thing. When COVID hit, right, we saw the failure of that system. So hospitals were inundated with sick patients. Everybody still wanted to get their testing done for COVID because they didn't feel well, not deathly ill, but still people, who had a little sore throat, a little bit of fever, but were okay, didn't need to get hospitalized, going to the ER, because that's what you do, right?
Yeah.
And your doctor's office is closed, so you can't go there, and the system wasn't geared for that type of mass screening. The system is geared to identify problems on people and get them to the next level of care for what it is. So the system fell apart. And that's where we started to see communities like Detroit, our efforts in the city, which we talked about, to initiate drive-through testing and programs. How do you get people the care or the prevention screening work, in this case, COVID screening, right? It's somewhat prevention, it's somewhat, identification and diagnosis. But how do you create a system for effective and efficient delivery of that care that is different than the current system, because the current system doesn't work.
And some of that you start inventing on the ground while you're in the middle of this.
Exactly. The expression building the airplane while flying has been, overused during the pandemic, rightfully so perhaps. But the reality is nobody's ever done this before. So we had to think of systems to, intake people, get HIPAA compliant results delivered to them. But at the same point, the system worked really well. Anybody who wanted a COVID test after a little bit of time, unfortunately,
once you got it implemented,
could get a COVID test anywhere they want. The system was then morphed for vaccinations, right? It was the same model. If we went with the old way, the model for vaccination was make an appointment, see your doctor, get your vaccination. We know from flu vaccines, like having them readily available in CVS and everything, increased uptake. And then we started to learn, why don't we take the system that we use for mass screening of COVID with testing, use it for vaccinations? It worked quite well. You can't force everybody to get tested, right? But you can create the infrastructure to make access to that stuff barrier-free.
Barrier-free.
And if we think going forward from a prevention mindset, it's the same problem with high blood pressure screening, diabetes screening, cholesterol screening, kidney disease screening. All you need is a blood pressure cuff, a little bit of know-how from the person doing it, and the ability to draw blood, whether that blood comes from a venipuncture or in the future, finger sticks and blood cards and what have you. Create the infrastructure that makes all that readily accessible to people in at-risk communities. And that's how you're going to change the outcomes here. You're not going to change the outcomes by wishful thinking that if we only go back to the system as it was before, things would be great, because it didn't work before and it's not going to work in the future.
Because you're trying to address all sorts of different things there. Well, as we look back at COVID, give us just a word about what do you think are maybe the top 1, 2, or 3 lessons that we need to take forward? Because I want to get to data. I want to talk about data with you, but what are some of the things looking back that we most need to keep in mind about what we learned?
Perhaps most important is we need, and this leads into data, we need accessible information infrastructure to be able to address new problems when they crop up and not invent the infrastructure on the fly and catch up to the problem, right? So, an example is COVID prevalence, COVID vaccination data. The state collected all that information, and in the beginning, the state held on to it very tightly. And I don't know, some of that might have been political, some of that might, who knows, right? But at the end of the day, when you have innovators like the room full of people here, like the work that we're doing, needing that information to best implement a solution, it's got to be shared. And so how do you create the right infrastructure to do that in a way that doesn't threaten patient, security, of information, but at the same time can help inform solutions? So I think data infrastructure is woefully inadequate in this country, particularly for these grand scheme, these grand problems, and that needs to change. We need to have greater flexibility in delivery models and reimbursement for those models. Right now, a lot of what's been done in COVID, vaccines were free, monoclonal antibodies are free, COVID testing for a lot of communities is free. That's great, but the infrastructure needed to deliver that is not free. It costs, right? When we first started doing our work, it was all volunteers. You know how long volunteerism lasts? Only so long, right? Because people have to get back to their lives.
A part of the solution here was that we took extraordinary measures to make this free, but that's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable. I mean, you can make the things free, the vaccines free, but the people still need to get paid, and the infrastructure still needs to exist, and that all costs money. So how do you create a reimbursement model going forward that allows flex up during these times, right? Allows flex up to respond to the needs of the circumstance. And I think finally, though not really finally, but third point is that the reason for the poor outcomes, like we discussed, was the severity of the infection, but mainly because it was superimposed on a population that wasn't healthy enough to start with. And so from a prevention lens, why wasn't it healthy enough? Because everybody's forced to get that prevention care in the same system, and it doesn't work for everybody. Simply put, right? How do we change it so that the system can work for everybody? It can be delivered barrier-free so that the community is healthier and ready next time when the next pandemic comes along.
Yeah, in other words, it really wasn't not our business how the health of that person over there was or the health of that person over there was in a population sense, because there was a ticking time bomb sitting there that we weren't aware of.
I just to say, I think to some level we've been aware of it, right? There are umpteen publications on how impoverished minority communities do worse. We know this, right? And it's time that we move, and we'll talk about this in a minute, right? From the idea of data for identification to data for action. Right? It's not enough anymore to say, yes, this population does worse because they have poor food access. What are you doing to bring food access to that population? We already know the problem. We knew these problems before the pandemic, right? But I don't think there was maybe the will, the fortitude to challenge the system.
Not actionable at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and this brings us to data, right? Because collecting this data, using this data in your talk, you were showing some really cool graphics of how, at least in the city of Detroit, you guys have been able to look and start to chart some things and be able to, I want to know that particular area, that neighborhood, whatever, what's going on. This allows you to do cool things. But tell us about your vision for data.
So our vision for data, it started prior to the pandemic with this concept of trying to understand why people in Detroit die more frequently and younger from heart disease. It all traces back to the risk factors, especially high blood pressure. We started to conceptualize this concept of what is the pressure load on the population, right? How much does blood pressure impact a population, and how is that different in a neighborhood by neighborhood basis? We have a big problem all in the city of Detroit. We have a big issue with lifespan inequality in the city of Detroit. There are neighborhoods across the city where people are dying 5 to 15 years younger than the state average. It's not the entire city.
Just
it's
certain
pockets.
neighborhoods.
It's neighborhoods.
Pockets.
So how do we try to understand what's going on in those neighborhoods? What's the risk factors, right? Is it more older individuals? Is it being in proximity to an oil refinery? Is it being near the old incinerator, which thankfully is no longer in business, right? Whatever it might be, what's contributing to that, right? And then getting that information in the hands, not just of providers, and certainly not just in the hands of researchers so that they can write another paper that does nothing to change health outcomes. How do you get it into the hands of innovators, of incubators, and into people who are in the intervention delivery arm so that you can actually close the loop. Right?
People can actually take action on it in the short term.
Exactly. And it's hard because you have a lot of new innovations coming in terms of sort of understanding, community-based sensors and environmental exposures and this survey and that survey. But at the end of the day, what you really want to know is how does that tie in to action and better outcomes? What do you do with this information, and what you did with this information, did it change anything?
Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is when you start to integrate availability of health outcome data. And it's well beyond, just prevalence data or high-level data that comes from the state and is 3 years old by the time it gets into the hands of people, right? You need it to be readily actionable so that people can see it in, if not near real time, with minimal lag from its, acquisition, and then show trends and changes over time. So I think that's a lot of what, I was trying to describe here. And our program around Phoenix incorporates multiple different health sources of data to look at risk and outcomes, high blood pressure and myocardial infarction rates in a community, but also incorporates a multitude of social factors, historic redlining, pollution, smoking, exercise, income, those types of things, to really understand where you want to try to target for upstream impact. An example from a policy perspective, right, is taking information on density of fast food restaurants in a community.
Wow.
If you have a community that already has a higher than normal stroke or heart attack risk and abysmal blood pressure control, and a Church's Fried Chicken and a Burger King and a McDonald's on every corner, the next time somebody comes in with a permit request for a building, shouldn't that come into consideration?
Should that be something we think about?
Right? We should be thinking about the health and well-being of the communities holistically when we think about how to use data. And that's what I mean about having that information
Because if we're seeing
available.
that correlation there, and we
Yeah.
see that every time we've got this kind of a store demographic here, we're having these kinds of health problems. We're not saying, no, don't do it, but we're saying, hold on, we might want to limit this, because if we can see that kind of control over it, it would be good to know.
Yeah, and if you can then combine it in a way that passively allows benefit to be shown, right? Imagine the first city councilor who says, no, we rejected that, and look, over the next 6 months, we saw a decline in blood pressure at the population level and, fewer heart attacks. Not saying that's going to happen, right? Could. Right? Especially if you find communities that are harder hit. One of the things we can do by combining data with Phoenix is we have data from ER visits, so we can look at people who go to the ER for asthma. As an example, we can look at self-reported asthma rates, and we can see communities that have the exact same self-reported asthma rate, but one has 5 times greater ER utilization than another. Why? What are we going to do about that?
Yeah.
Is it because they don't get the right medications, or is it because there are environmental factors or other socio-demographic factors in that neighborhood that are there but hidden? And let's get them to the fore. You got to
get them uncovered.
You got to uncover it so that people understand.
This brings me to the topic of sort of data, not so much quality. I mean, quality matters, data quality matters, but also data consistency or format. And the thing in the back of my head and my day job, medical devices, right? And we talk about interoperability. And so I'm thinking of this as an interoperability problem, if you will. And one of the things that you find is that, I took this reading. Well, how that device or that system takes that reading might be different from how a different one does that. When you think about population health data, certainly if you're within a healthcare system that from the top can mandate this is how we collect it, great. But as you go and you incorporate more and more and more to it, do you foresee or have you experienced problems where they collected data on that topic and they collected data on that topic, but they didn't do it in the same way?
Absolutely.
And how do you address that?
Absolutely. And I think this gets back to that initial issue of personal versus population health, right? On a personal level, if I want to understand, your heart disease risk, your cardiovascular risk, whatever it might be that we're looking at with a new device, I want to be able to ascertain your information and integrate it with other data streams in a unified manner to understand the complementarity of that piece of information. At a population level, that's a little bit less important, right? Because what what the concept really is how do we understand risk in an area, then deploy resources to that area, addressing the mediators and moderators of that risk. And it may be that an individual person in that risk profile requires something else at a personal level, but this helps us know where to go. And so we don't need to perceive a barrier to that integration of data, because the uniformity in my end is geospatial alignment, right? Meaning that what matters most is I see these outcomes in this area, and these are the factors that go into it. That's a little bit less of a data challenge other than attaching a geocode to where that information comes from. The other piece is temporality, right? At a given time, a given location, and then changes over time.
You're not trying to compare a particular blood pressure reading between that person and that person. You're trying to say, okay, now that all these factors have added up, this person is in this condition and so is this person. Oh, look, they live in the same place.
Yeah, and then now here's where it kind of comes together, right? To better feed into the population understanding that uniformity of the data acquisition piece is important, right? You know what I'm saying? Yep. And so I think it depends on, understanding intended use of the information, and then making sure, as you said, that everybody's kind of looking at it from a similar lens and understanding what you're trying to do with that information. If all I care about from a practice level is that my patients are all wearing these sensors and I can understand at each patient level what's going on, that's one thing. If at a practice level I want to know the population of my patients, well, how well does that information integrate with my EHR so that I can understand it? If I want to incorporate that into Phoenix, right? How well does that information, as you were saying, align with other variables that are similar and being collected? And there have been a lot of efforts from Odyssey, you may have heard of that, groups that are trying to streamline data, information, and transformation so it all looks the same on the back end. And common data elements and common data languages are evolving. But some of the problem here is that some of the biggest players, like the EHR vendors, are not so interested in population. They're interested in what they do, and everybody else either
which is still personal, individual data records. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. Dr. Levy, this is so cool what you're doing. And I think it's so neat, the new position that you're in, Associate Vice President for Translational Sciences at Wayne State. You're in this position now to take all that you've done in your emergency medicine career with everything during the pandemic, and you're passionate, clearly, about making it implemented and to a worthy population, too, here in the city of Detroit, Wayne State University.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Gene. And I think, to all the, innovators and entrepreneurs out there that are listening, it's not just about here, it's about scale, right? How do we use what we're doing in Detroit as the proof of concept and the proof of principle to expand nationwide? There are many cities, and not as many that are as racially segregated as Detroit are, but a lot of cities with similar issues of socio-demographic challenges, poverty, what have you. How do you take the lessons we've learned here and apply them more broadly? How do we get the payers involved? And that's the next step that we're really working on, is trying to get the payers on board with this idea, because it's great to get grants and it's great to get funding. And, we talked a little bit before, and I mentioned in there the success that we've had, which is fantastic. But at the end of the day, the sustainability only comes when this is the norm, not, a demonstration or the exception.
Everybody understands how it works.
Yeah.
Well, we hope that when you are doing this nationwide, you're going to come on again.
Of course.
And it's only going to be about 6 months, so we're looking forward to that day.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for doing the keynote here at MedHealth.
Oh, of course, and thank you for sponsoring.
Thank you for that. And if you want to see any of the other interviews we've had with Dr. Levy, you can go to intubeing.com. You can get down to MedTech Crossroads there through the menu, and we would love to see you. You can also see it on YouTube now, streaming live on YouTube. In fact, today, streaming live on YouTube. You're welcome to go there and to see some of those episodes. So thank you, Dr. Levy, for being here today.
Thank you, Gene.
Always good to be with Dr. Philip Levy. I was joking with him during the interview that soon he's going to be doing this nationally. And then he showed me some details on his Phoenix project for the city of Detroit. And I keep watching that guy. He's going to be doing some amazing things. Well, it's past the top of the hour, so we're going to let you all go, let our live viewers go. We thank you for being here today with us. We used the half hour there to rearrange the studio, so I hope you like the new setup. Medica in Dusseldorf, Germany next week because of MEDC. We're going to be out there. Hope to bring you some coverage of that next week, as well as more MedHealth interviews. Join us next Friday on MedTech Crossroads. We will stay on for just a couple minutes in case there are any questions, comments, or event announcements that you would like to bring to us. Feel free to raise a hand. We understand if you have to go, though. It is past the top of the hour. And just checking here, not seeing any raised hands or any other announcements. So I want to thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you next week on MedTech Crossroads. Hope you're enjoying the new format. Hope you're enjoying those weekly emails that come with all the chopped up segments from each week's live show. So we're going to keep doing that. Great feedback from that. And thank you for being here and making it what it is. We appreciate you. Talk soon. Bye-bye.